Before the formation of what we know today as the NHL, there was the 1914-15 Ottawa Senators. And on those Senators was a gentleman named Art Ross. He's known for running the Boston Bruins for a third of a century, but before the days of the Spoked Bee, he was a really good defenseman by all accounts. And keep in mind all the weird rules that were in place back then. Here are just some things that you'd find in the rulebook for most or all of the 1910s. Instead of these 4 bullets, I could have just written the word torture. Anyway, these are the conditions Art Ross and his coach Alf Smith found himself facing with the Sens in 1915. From looking at the goals for and against, you can see that the Senators were a defensive team, not a scoring one. But they were tied in the standings with the Montreal Wanderers, who averaged over 6 goals per game. Now this was over 100 years ago, when sports made no sense, so the champion of the league was going to be decided on a tiebreaker across 2 games. The team with the most goals across them would be the champion. But why not just make it 1? Or a best of 3? Why? The legend goes that on the train ride to Montreal, Coach Smith, Art Ross, and his friends had an idea. When the Senators squared off against that juggernaut offense in Montreal, who they had lost to 15-6 and 18-1 that season, on Saturday, March 13th, 1915, they executed the first documented variant of the neutral zone trap. Ottawa's skater corps consisted of a center, a winger, and 3 defensemen back. According to Ross, who played right defense, the forwards forechecked as normal, but if an opponent came down their right wing, he'd angle him to the outside and, I quote, "the other fellows covered my position." And since forward passing was not allowed, the Wanderers got nothing going. It's not exactly the trap, but nor is it a defense formation that formed out of pure chance. It was an intentional, disruptive strategy that neutralized a superior offense. In those 2 games, the Senators allowed 1 goal, and were the 1915 NHA champions. They brought, as the Ottawa Evening Journal said, the old mug back. This is the beginning of the neutral zone trap. This is an overused, pretentious word, but let's start by demystifying what the trap is in its most well-known form in the modern NHL. The trap is a forechecking system that relies on trapping attackers on the boards, usually in the neutral zone, to force them to get rid of the puck or cause a turnover. Its initial popularized form was the 1-2-2. As the attacking team regroups in the neutral zone, the 1 in 1-2-2 pressures the puck carrier, trying to force a turnover or at least funnel him to the boards. F2 and F3, the first 2 in 1-2-2, read the play and shift to whatever side the puck is on. The closer forward keeps the puck carrier along the boards, and the further takes away the middle pass lane. D1 comes up to meet the puck carrier, and that basically exhausts all of their options, save for dumping it in, which is what D2 is for, covering the dump in and the far side options. And because of the 2-line pass rule, being that you can't make a pass from your defensive zone past the red line, it meant at best the attacking team was stopped up at center ice, or level with or behind the puck carrier, which made the trap's forward pressure even more limiting. The goal of this formation isn't just to crush anything coming through neutral, it's also presumed that this is the best strategy for getting an odd man rush, or at least an even strength rush the other way, should you succeed in causing a turnover. It is, in theory, a sound counter-attacking strategy, not purely a defensive one. There are slight variations based on whether or not the puck carrier holds onto the puck, passes to his D partner, the timing of said pass, etc., but that's the gist of it. In theory, it's deceptively simple, but it requires all 5 skaters reading the play in split seconds and hustling to their assignments to do it well. If they don't, well, these are NHL caliber players. But in the court of public opinion, to varying degrees throughout the NHL's eras, a strategy like this that relied on stopping momentum before starting it back up again the other way, or even just slowing the game, period, was going to be worse received the better it did its job, because of what the sport has cultivated as its chief value proposition, its flow, and its speed. Like most sports, offense is glorified in hockey. It seems like every step forward in terms of rule changes in the league's infancy was to promote more offense. Granted, in those days it was warranted. In 1928-29, when the forward pass wasn't allowed in the offensive zone, the final scores of every Stanley Cup final game looked like this. The year after, when the forward pass was allowed without restriction, the average goal per game by a team doubled, jumping by a goal and a half. That improved things, but soon the lack of offense was derided in the public discourse because of intentional use in strategy, not bad rulings. On December 8th, 1931, the New York Americans led the Boston Bruins 2-1, 3-1, and 3-2 in the third period. Whenever they got the puck, they'd just send it back down the rink to stall, since icing didn't exist back then. It was awful. On January 3rd, the Bruins retaliated by doing the same thing, and the result was one of the most universally despised games you'll ever hear about. Beat writers around the East Coast panned this display. It was the first scoreless draw of the 31-32 season. Hockey's cardinal sin, and probably that of all sports, has always been to be boring. Conn Smythe, owner of the Maple Leafs from 1927 to 1961, famously accused the Canadiens and Red Wings of playing kitty bar the door hockey, which is better known today as turtling. You get the lead and then you play to not lose. Of course, the Maple Leafs themselves were often accused of playing kitty bar the door hockey, because they did play kitty bar the door hockey. Hap Day, the Maple Leafs coach for the entire 40s, was known for coaching it. Pace slowing or boring defense has always been looked down on in the fastest sport on earth. But it's Smythe's accusation of the Red Wings playing boring defensive hockey that is equally interesting. Despite accusations of playing too defensively, the Red Wings, when that accusation was made, led the league in goals for, led the league in goals against, and won that year's Stanley Cup. The accusation of mind-numbing defensive hockey being misrepresented as a crutch for an otherwise unskilled team, which we will see a lot of in the future, also goes way, way back. But ragging the puck every time you breathe isn't the trap. The neutral zone trap requires sophistication and a neutral zone. According to anecdotal evidence, the first time something like it may have been used to slow pace throughout the neutral zone by a professional team was across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1970s. The trap, and its variants, are particularly effective at neutralizing a superior opponent's offense. And in the 1970s, who was more superior than the Soviets? As stated, the evidence is mostly anecdotal, but Czechoslovakian and Swedish teams of this decade used a prototype of the trap, the left-wing lock, to keep up with the Soviets, the greatest hockey team assembled in that era easily. It wasn't exactly the neutral zone trap as we know it today, but it was the trap in the same way that the puckle gun was a machine gun. It's fairly straightforward. You play as normal, but once you lose possession of the puck, the left wing drops back instantly and forms a line alongside the other two defensemen. Why the left wing and not the center, I'm not sure. Ask the Czechs or the Slovaks. If the puck comes up left, the left wing would take his chance at the puck carrier coming up the ice, trying to create a turnover, giving the other two forwards an opportunity to backcheck. If the puck comes up right, there's two defensemen waiting there. In Sweden, there was allegedly a slightly different version, a 1-3-1 style. The 1-3-1 is an even more conservative variant of the 1-2-2, where there's only one forechecker and just a wall of defense in the neutral zone, plus one guy covering their butts. That's a massive oversimplification, but that's what it looked and felt like to the average viewer to see. Now, I watched as many Sweden vs. USSR games as I could find, and I didn't see the 1-3-1 in any of them. What I did see was the USSR walk Sweden 13-4, 6-1, etc. There was an appearance of the 1-2-2, but I'm not entirely positive video evidence exists that the Swedes really used the 1-2-2 or 1-3-1 against the Soviets in full. The only place I found that Sweden was able to successfully set up the formation was in their bronze medal game in the 1980 Winter Olympics. Every other matchup available to me made it seem that Sweden kept getting burned by the Soviets' speed before they could set anything up. But against the Soviets in that decade, there's no shame in that. The Swedes definitely did use the 1-3-1 to great effect domestically at the turn of the 1990s, just a few years before it would become infamous in the NHL. But that's skipping ahead. If anyone out there can find more definitive evidence of either team's usage of the trap in this time frame, please share it in the comments below. Until further evidence is presented, the evidence in this section should be classified as tenuous. And now we've reached the end of the kind of traps and the one-off traps and non-NHL leagues. This next stage in the life of the neutral zone trap saw it grow fangs in the best league in the world. An NHL team willfully and intentionally deployed a neutral zone trap, game-wide, recorded for the very first time in 1975. Ironically, against the very same opponent. December 31st, 1975. It was the first game of the Super Series 76, a slew of exhibition games where teams from the Soviet Champions League toured North America to play against NHL teams, the first such time it had happened. But make no mistake, nobody treated these bouts as exhibitions. They played for national pride at the height of the Cold War. The Moscow Central Sports Club of the Army, also known colloquially as the Red Army, was the best team in their league, winning their championship 13 straight years. The Canadiens were the best in theirs. And in this game, one of the Canadiens' immortal lines executed the neutral zone trap with counterattacking gumption, the likes of which no team had seen. Bob Gainey, one of the best defensive forwards to ever wear a Canadian sweater, is pushing the Soviets to the outside. This young gentleman is covering the middle lane, should the Soviet defender try and squeeze a pass through to the middle anyway. He could always pass backwards, but that kills the team's forward momentum and gives the Canadiens even more time to clog up the neutral zone. Now, the Soviets were the Soviets, so they did decently well anyway, but they repeatedly ran into that second man covering the middle lane. Even when late coming back, the guy supported the first forechecker up through the middle, and if he wasn't F2, he was F1, with his line mates Gainey and Lafleur closing off the middle, or up the boards immediately in front of the puck carrier. And even then, this player would make sure he got back into the play. This player's name is Jacques Lemaire, and on Scotty Bowman's 1970s Canadiens, he was able to use the neutral zone trap on a team that was great enough to use absolutely any strategy and win. But Jacques Lemaire and his line mates chose the trap. By name, a counterattacking strategy that required keeping pucks and puck carriers to the outside and taking away options along the boards in the neutral zone. As a matter of fact, the only times the Soviets scored was when they were able to get stretch plays going through the middle of the ice, which should speak to how pertinent the trap was in this game. The Soviets weren't able to get anything through the neutral zone, much less to Ken Dryden, and it helped the Canadiens skate to a 3-3 tie, though the only reason it wasn't a blowout was due to Vladislav Tretiak's heroics in the Red Army net. Playing a sneaky, frustrating style away from the puck also helped matters for the Habs. If you inverse the roles, making the pesky physical style the main course and the defensive stacking up the side dish, then you have the recipe the Flyers used to demolish Moscow in the final game of this series. They didn't use the trap exactly, but it was a defensive posture all the same. The 1970s Habs were famous for team defense. Well, they were famous for everything, really. Toe Blake in the prior decade was known for playing some conservative defenses, but again, nothing with such a specific formation and nothing that also had counterattacks imbued into its DNA. Scotty Bowman used the trap more widely with the 1970s Canadiens, but it was used to protect leads. That doesn't mean it was rarely used, though. Those Canadiens led a lot, but it still wasn't the team's full-time option. It appeared to be the 2-1-2, or at times the 1-1-3, and the 1-1-2 at various points. Okay, you know what? It was everything. The Canadiens did everything. It's probably all and none of these at the same time. Now, you may be thinking that these don't really seem like the trap, capital T. And that's because, this being a date after 2004 that you're watching this, you have a very clear idea in your head of what the trap looked like. And the sport hadn't quite yet evolved to that point. Hockey in the 70s was more open and more rough and tumble than outright brutal. And before it would become those things, the game would open up way more. Almost nobody used the trap in the 80s, but there were few, very few, who understood the importance of defense as a springboard for the counterattack, in an age where everyone favored the all-out blitz. The Islanders were the last out-and-out dynasty in the National Hockey League. They had immense talent and really well-rounded team makeups. Furthermore, they were one of the only stout defensive teams in the early 80s with the influx of players from the WHA. That's not to say they were defensively minded, but they were solid defensively because of Al Arbour and his stress on two-way play. In the 1983 Stanley Cup Finals, they went up against the inevitable Oilers, who scored over 400 goals the prior season, the first time in NHL history a team had done it. Even the 1971 Bruins, the most dominant team of all time, scored 399. And again in 1983, the Oilers surpassed their own mark with 424. Scoring was up everywhere. The Oilers were young and only going to get better. No, not better, more world-beating. The Islanders played a more methodical game and found themselves right in the trolley tracks of Gretzky, Messier, Anderson, Curry, and the rest, and their all-out attack. With their two-way system, the Islanders swept the 1983 Oilers, allowing only 6 goals. They didn't use the trap, but it was with these Islanders we got our first look at how a defensively set posturing can have tremendous success slowing the opponent's offense down in the modern NHL. And this was the age of offense in the modern NHL. But we're coming up on the first written proof of a team-wide trap system used by an NHL club. And the history of this strategy swirls around this team for the next 20 years with intrigue and nuance that illuminates everything that there is to know about the trap and its effects on the league. You may think it's the Devils. It isn't. It's their arch rival. It's the Rangers. Behold, the first written proof that a team employed the neutral zone trap with the full colors that we know it by today. And from the mouth of a player, no less. Thank you, Pierre LaRouche. The 1-4 is the most conservative form of the trap. If it looks less interesting and more simplistic, it's because it is. You have one forechecker doing his thing, and everyone else forms a wall in neutral. But what was the context for its use here? It's 1985, and the New York Rangers are bad. Bad enough that they just fired coach Herb Brooks, and general manager Craig Patrick is now behind the bench. They made the playoffs, but they only had 26 wins. Evidently, they either used the 1-4, which is the easiest iteration to implement, and failed, or turned to it in an effort to turn the season around. Neither diagnosis is flattering to the trap. They clearly did rely on the 1-4 frequently, which occasionally morphed into the 1-1-3, another low-risk iteration, and I think it's pretty clear that this team needed a kind of system like that. Boy, the Rangers in the last half-century have really been through the ringer in terms of coaching style whiplash, which I'll get into more later. Patrick was known for drafting a lot of players from Europe, particularly Sweden, so it's entirely possible that some of that old 70s influence of the proto-trap made its way to him there. But admittedly, that is 1000% conjecture. This was a far cry from Brooks' style, who favored a much more aggressive, fast-paced game. He was quoted as saying, "The idea is to give the game back to the players, not to suffocate them. We want to provide an environment that brings out their talent, so it's fun to come to the rink." He got it. Regardless, that's where the available data on the 1985 Rangers ends. It was 39 years ago, and bad teams in a less popular sport just don't get the same kind of public-facing documentation that a researcher like me would like. Fortunately for me, and now for you, a very, very good team in a less popular sport 39 years ago does warrant a bit more of pen on paper. And now a good team succeeded with the trap full-time, for the first time, in the National Hockey League. After the Canadiens dynasty of the 1970s and the subsequent expansion/WHA integration, the Canadiens didn't have the cup wins to show for their efforts like they used to, until the mid-80s, when they were coached by this guy. Do you remember him? No? This is Jacques Lemaire, the very same player who played the trap with his line informally with the Canadiens a decade prior, probably the first time it was consciously used by a National Hockey League team. A decade before the trap would become the dreaded name of the league, Lemaire found success with it as part of the same franchise that had helped him create it. In his time, you bet your bottom dollar there was a Canadian absolutely hounding the puck carrier while the others were ready in the neutral zone to pounce on any turnovers. And so were F2 and F3, forcing the puck carriers to the outside or otherwise backwards. This was the team that well and truly used, implemented, and succeeded with the neutral zone trap through and through. And given that this was the 80s and there was more space on the ice than there's ever been, you could see the fruits of actual counterattacks far more often than in the 90s. Of all the teams I saw footage of while studying the trap, the mid-80s Canadiens were the team that I most clearly saw the transition from 1-2-2 to a counterattack the other way. They did it so noticeably, and in a time when such a formation wasn't really known, that as you heard at the beginning of the video, the play-by-play took notice.
At any point. Look at this, no forechecker at all. No forechecker at all. All three of them right all the way back. Game possession, Svoboda ices it. Once again, nobody went into forecheck, just turned around and picked up somebody. That's amazing. I've not seen this year in the National Hockey League.
That soundbite is probably the closest we will ever get to hearing the very first verbal reaction to the neutral zone trap. This game was between the Montreal Canadiens and Edmonton Oilers on February 27th, 1985. In some form or another, the trap had been around for a few years. The Rangers were probably the first team to adopt it full-time, but since nowhere I can find is there any prior description of the formation or of the name, just some vague references to the trap style, I think on that day, February 27th, 1985 or thereabouts, is when people began to notice the trap. How far did Lemaire's Canadiens go with the trap? In 1985, they won their division and squared off against the Nordiques in round 2 of the playoffs. But in an improbable upset that ended in overtime of Game 7, their Stanley Cup dreams ended. One season later, without Lemaire, the Canadiens won their 23rd Stanley Cup. And in the next few years, teams would really begin to take notice and use the trap for their own. Unfortunately, many were less akin to the skilled and successful 85 Canadiens and more akin to the 85 Rangers, holding on for dear life. Get ready for more Canadiens, folks. Bob Gainey, a few years out of retirement, was hired as the North Stars coach for the 90-91 season. In his playing days, he was a wonderful defensive forward, never putting up points like Shutt or Lafleur would, but always reliable in his own zone. His thinking showed. As a first-year coach, he would stand 4 defenders up at the blue line, force the other team to dump it in, and hold the attackers up at the blue line. It helped that Mark Tenorti was the only real offensive defenseman, and the rest were sort of forced to stay back. He did this partially because it was effective, and partially because against superior teams like the Oilers and Penguins that they faced in the playoffs, the North Stars didn't have much else to rely on aside from just strangling the rush. And the collapsing style was present even all the way back in the defensive zone. But these Stars are noticeable for another reason. It becomes very apparent the longer you watch them of a new trend creeping into the league. The interference, the clutching, the grabbing, the hauling downing. Around the turn of the 90s, obstruction had become a trend, and then it became prevalent, and then it became an art form. In the series you see in front of you, the Oilers got choked off, but also choked out by the grueling beatdowns of the North Stars. They could do nothing with their speed, nothing with their playmaking, and nothing under the shadow of both obstruction and the trap. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 90s. Somehow I've gone over 2 years on this channel with hardly mentioning the immortal Roger Neilson. Known more for his innovations than his success, which there was not much of, at the end of the 80s, he found himself implementing the trap with the New York Rangers at a time when obstruction would compound the slowing down of the game's pace. Whether that was coincidence or Neilson intentionally capitalizing on what he foresaw being a viable field-leveling option in the NHL, I can't say for certain. But given his cunning, I would like to think so. He may have foresaw that. But could he have foreseen everything that this decade would bring upon the hockey world? Neilson implemented the trap with moderate success after taking over as Rangers bench boss in 1989, which is the first time the words neutral zone trap appear together in print. And the presence of inquisitive quotation marks implies to me that the phrase was not well known at all. In the 1989-90 season, the Rangers did decently well, but the effect was the same. People did not like the trap. They executed the 1-1-3 to pretty good effect, holding leads and keeping the goals against down to .267, 5th in the league. The shine looked like it was wearing off in 90-91, as the Rangers could only manage the exact same record, but the next season, Roger Neilson led the Rangers to a 50-win campaign, 3rd in goals for, 4th in goals against. But in 1993, what happened? Neilson got canned after a slow start, but there was more than just the record ledger that was responsible. The driver was Mark Messier, and Mark Messier is Mark Messier. Neilson, with his trap, believed in counterattacking. Messier simply believed in attacking. He thought that the defensive posturing was holding the Rangers' talent back, so he stood up to the coach, or mutinied, depending on how you look at it, and got him sacked. A little over a year later, the Rangers won the Stanley Cup. Interestingly, the Rangers went from 304 goals for in 1993 to 299 in 94, and on goals against, 308 to 231. They actually scored less and got scored on way less in a non-trap season. The fact that the Mike Keenan-led Rangers changed to a more attacking style is important, because in 1994, the trap was still an option around the league and not the norm for most teams that it would become. But that year, another coach's inaugural season with a new team brought the trap to a team of destiny. And unlike Nielsen's Rangers, they would find playoff success with the trap, transfiguring it from just one conservative option best used situationally to a full-time, 60-minute, franchise-defining boon for the counter-attacking team. And this coach didn't just plan the trap, he lived it. Jacques Lemaire was now the coach of the New Jersey Devils. He was not the coach of the Rangers. He was not the coach of the North Stars. He was not the coach of the Islanders, or the Swedes, or the Czechs, or the 1915 Ottawa Senators. Much has been said about the trap thus far, about its inception, or inceptions, how in one form or another it had been used intentionally for almost a decade, and just recently began to be the full-time option for a few teams to operate. And yet now, in 1994, specifically with the Devils, this is where the loudest voices will say the trap was born. It's just not the case. In the early 90s, plenty of teams were using the trap. Allegedly, some 20 of the league's 26 teams were using it in one form or another. But nobody mastered it quite like the New Jersey Devils. The Devils were a very well-rounded, deep team when Lemaire took over. They were middle of the pack in the 92-93 season under, Herb Brooks again. And they immediately enjoyed a 19-point improvement to second in the league and a trip to Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Final in Lemaire's first year. Deservedly, he won the Jack Adams Award as Coach of the Year. Ken Daneyko, the immortal New Jersey Devils defenseman, says that there is one aspect of the 1994-95 Devils' defensive play that helped give them the success they had that was totally independent of Lemaire's trap: stick positioning. Game-changing skills were taught to Daneyko and company by coach Larry Robinson, who himself had a 20-year career in the NHL, winning 6 championships with the 1970s Canadiens. Larry Robinson was Lemaire's teammate on those Canadiens and subordinate as a player on the 80s Canadiens. If there was ever a treasure trove of defensive knowledge you could get from any duo on a historically dominant hockey team, it would be those two. Daneyko asserts that Robinson's influence on the little things that go into playing smart, positional, economic defense, as opposed to the shot-blocking, overly physical idea of defense, allowed him to stay in the league another decade plus. That's how effective Robinson's tutelage was. That is as high praise as you can give a coach. But that's not the kind of thing the average fan notices, or, unfortunately, cares to notice. The Devils played the trap, and people didn't like it. And since they were very good, they played the trap very well, and people hated it. They had the nascent Martin Brodeur, who handled the puck frequently enough to almost be considered a third defenseman, behind the actual defensemen who ranged from the reliable, wearying Scott Stevens and Ken Daneyko to the intelligent and fleet-footed Scott Niedermayer and later Brian Rafalski.
Look how the Devils are turning it back up ice. John McLean. McLean moving, dropped it, shot, score! Great setup to Scott Niedermayer!
And their forwards boasted a host of names not many people outside the Devils fan base know particularly well, but were well-rounded players on top of being reliable producers. And that list would only grow in future years. One thing that did not help their image, however, was that they lacked the out-and-out elite offensive talents that were revolutionizing the sport in that decade. It's hard to be particularly inspired by John McLean, Valery Zelepukin, or Patrick Elias when you could otherwise see Peter Forsberg, Mario Lemieux, Jaromir Jagr, Sergei Fedorov, or anyone whose offensive skill left you wowed. Side note, I caught some flack for saying the Devils didn't have elite offensive talent in the last playoffs pass video, but when I said not a lot of high-end offensive talent, I meant not a lot of high-end offensive talent. Not the Devils were not a good offensive team. They were. They were second in the league in goals in 1994, and in that decade, they had a pretty high correlation between prolific scoring and playoff success. No way. But that was a product of being a deep team that got production from up and down the lineup, not mostly from a superstar or superstars who could break the game with their offense. And the stats back this up. When you look at all the teams who had players with 80-plus point seasons, the Devils are an afterthought. But when you lower that to a solid but less ostentatious 50-point seasons, the Devils had way more of those, and they're up there with the best of them. That they had no offense or didn't take offensive chances was only a perception, ungrounded in reality. Stéphane Richer said that players like John McClain, Neil Broughton, Claude Lemieux, and himself were tasked with taking more chances offensively, and among them, they had some pretty high scores that playoff year. But if you're the Devils, you don't care what your perception is. You scored the second most goals in the league, and you turned your season around, nearly enough for a cup final shot, all in one go. Who cares what other people think? The next season, though, the shine kind of wore off. It was a shortened season, so maybe the numbers didn't get a chance to progress to the mean. But the goals for and against, at a glance, threatened to vindicate all the inaccurate perceptions there were about the Devils being a team that had no offense and just sat back in their trap. Well, they did use their trap. But they again made it to the conference finals, and then beyond. The trap was used to devastating effect against the Bruins, then the Penguins, and then the Flyers in the conference finals. They limited their opponent to fewer than 25 shots 11 times, including every single game in the Flyers series. Every single one. In the Stanley Cup finals, they faced Scotty Bowman's Red Wings. Boy, was every coach in the 90s former Canadian staff? In any case, the result was a series where the Red Wings managed only 20 shots on Martin Brodeur once. Credit to Scotty Bowman, he didn't knock the very same system that he'd helped bring into the league. Despite losing, he knew that though it looked like cheap kitty bar the door hockey, the Devils did still just outplay the Red Wings. And Bowman, being the brilliant hockey mind that he is, was open to adaptation. Because Bowman's system was actually fairly similar. It was the left wing lock. Remember that? It was brought to the Wings in the 95 offseason by himself and assistant coach Barry Smith, though it was called the left side back within the ranks. No line had greater chemistry or effectiveness in this system than the grind line, comprised of the rotating Chris Draper, Kirk Maltby, Joey Kocur, and Darren McCarty. Adapting the left wing lock made the team focus on defense more, which caused a lot of friction among his players, until it worked with 3 Stanley Cups in the next 6 years. But that's a sister strategy. The real McCoy was the bread and butter of the Devils, and they made no mistakes with it. In those playoffs, the Devils played 20 games. Opposing teams only got more than 30 shots in a game through 60 minutes once. Game 5 against the Penguins with 32. Brodeur allowed 1 goal. The Devils eliminated the Penguins and advanced to the conference final, and then they beat the Flyers, and we know what happened next. Of course, the trap became the boogeyman for all the low offense, the slower pace, and above all, the bitter defeats. The Red Wings, who lost, said it would destroy hockey. Of course they would. The Devils, who won, said it was a disciplined, valid strategy. Of course they would. While very good, the Devils were the underdogs against the Wings, and the trap was a well-documented part of how they beat the Wings. But the following year didn't really see the explosion of copycats that you'd imagine. A different team would usher that in. The Devils' blueprint, while far from the first or most successful, was the first successful usage in front of a national audience during the NHL's age of rapid growth and expansion. That last part is so important for understanding how and why the trap would become so popular in this era. An era which, after 79 years of hockey history, we have finally arrived at the gates of. This is the dead puck era. This era, which in my estimation I'd call 94 to 04, was noted for low scoring, slower pace, and clogged up ice. The scoring was so low, in fact, that in 1987 to 88, the Herb Brooks-led Minnesota North Stars, there he is again, were last in the league with goals for at 242. 10 years later, in 97-98, in the full grip of the dead puck NHL, they scored 242 again. But that was the 3rd most in the league. But the entertainment doldrums that the league found itself in during this time were absolutely not solely the fault of the trap, and probably not even mostly. Few league-wide trends in the life cycle of sports and their rules and their cultures can be directly attributed to one single thing. Like most things in life, it's complicated. The dead puck era was caused by a perfect storm of things happening, or crossing paths in time at least, all at once. 1. The neutral zone trap's forthcoming popularity. As mentioned, it saw frequent use by 1994-95, but mostly among teams who wouldn't otherwise compete. It wasn't that much of a cause for concern initially. 2. Bigger and faster players, meaning less room on the ice. This is nobody's fault, and it's quite frankly a good problem to have. There are a few problems incurred by having a larger talent pool, and none of them, I would say, are that significant. It's just unfortunate that the increasing size of players started to become so important to playing the game, right at a time when physical space became a premium. 3. Obstruction. This is a very important one. Any choking off of momentum the trap was guilty of was made worse by the laissez-faire obstruction. Players who weren't as good or used size to their advantage were allowed to get away with it. Like players getting bigger and faster, this slowly came into the league so that it was hard to really notice how bad it was. When the trap could have been beat, players could easily resort to just plain interference. But it was hard to combat it in one fell swoop because, as Brian Burke once said, it had been coached into players to the point of being an art form. Number 4, the two-line pass. While players in prior decades weren't routinely fast enough to be held up by the two-line pass, just about the worst thing you could do for a speedy, skilled generation of players was to give them this rule. It simply hamstrung them, and every time I bring it up, I will say it is the worst rule in the modern NHL, with offside reviews a close second. Here's some homework for you. Watch games from the late 90s and make a mental note of how many times the attacking puck carrier has to pass into a sea of players that are only just outside his blue line because the forwards have to keep themselves behind the center red line. Number 5, goalies negating dump-ins. The last resort against all of the above gets turned right around by an alert goalie, snuffing out any light that may have been at the end of the tunnel. Now hopefully you can see how all of these things are heavily related to each other, and their existence in conjunction with the others makes each one worse. But I cannot stress enough the underrated impact of number 5, and of Martin Brodeur, on the dead puck era. Even if you had to deal with all 4 of the prior points, if you can dump the puck in where the defensemen have to retrieve it, you will always do at least one of 5 things. 1. Stretch play along the ice north-south, which at least gives the appearance of things happening. 2. Eat that much more time energy from the opposing defense. 3. Allow time for your team to change lines. 4. Put pressure on the defenseman playing the puck. And 5. Actually retrieve the puck in the offensive zone. What a novel idea. But with the goalie being free to roam the defensive zone, you're lucky if you can do even one of those first 3. Forget about 4 and 5. Martin Brodeur had such an effect on the balance of play and the process of defense to offense transition, just by skating 10 feet out to handle the puck, that the league implemented the trapezoid rule, which, ironically, has the word trap in it. Brodeur is the only player responsible for a rule change that literally altered the face of the rink that the sport is played on. The trapezoid line is one of the most impactful changes to combat the trap because they allow all 5 of the above to happen to improve the flow of the game, when before, they were pipe dreams. How do I know that this is the case? Because even nowadays, when a goalie comes out to play the puck, I groan a little. Now, given how fast players are now, there's a good chance the goalie gets pressured into making a stupid play, which happens more often than not, but getting pressured would have happened anyway if the dump-in had not been allowed to play out. That's anecdotal, but I feel like it has truck with most of you. At the time, to make matters worse, the known methods of beating the trap, because every system can be beat in theory, were now much less reasonable to expect. Speedy attackers could beat defending players rushing up the boards? Well, now everybody's speedy, including the defenders. Slick passers could rip one through the defensemen, like the Soviets did to the Canadiens. Well, stick skills are entering an entirely new universe compared to where it was back then. You could just dump it in and win the race. Well, the goalie's going to play the puck even if you beat the faster defender. About the only way to beat the game was to not play it. And that sucks. One of the reasons you didn't really notice proto 1-2-2 formations back in the 70s was because players just weren't the freak athletes that they were in the 90s. And in the 90s, they weren't the uber-mensch they are now. If you wanted to rip a pass across neutral, the defender might have fumbled the puck back then. Far less likely now. If you wanted to beat him up the boards, his angling skills probably weren't as good as they'd be in the 90s. You could just risk muscling through. Nope. Trappers could absolutely paste you into the boards, but back in the 70s, checking was more about tying up than outright hitting, so you'd see a lot less heavy impact contact, and so on and so on. It was more open because nobody was as scientific. The sport still had the untempered, tousled abandon that an optimized but clinical sport in the 21st century rarely sees.
Don Maloney. Save.
To be clear, the dead puck era is not boring to watch. Some of the greatest yarns in league history were woven in the 90s. I'd say a disproportionate amount compared to other decades. But once the trap started to be more situational, and players and coaches started to intentionally open up the game more, the dead puck era was some of the most well-rounded hockey you'll ever see. But we'll have to wait for the new millennium to see that. For now, we're stuck in the mud. And we're in the shadow of the real harbingers of the trap-dominated league, who, quite intentionally, took all the tired, inaccurate criticisms of the Devils and took it upon themselves to fully personify them. We've had quite a few big names make big returns in this video, so how's about another? The inaugural Panthers were coached by Roger Nielsen, and apparently he hadn't gotten enough of the trap because his Panthers used it all the time. Now remember, I said it was important that the trap was used in the era of NHL expansion, and that was because expansion teams adopted this trapping style when they saw it work because they weren't particularly good themselves. And when the Panthers adopted it in their inaugural season, oh by gee, by gosh, by gum, by jingo, people noticed. Now, I know I'm just showing the formations here, but that's just one symptom of the trap in this era. It was also identifiable from the bad passes in neutral, the icings from neutral, and just the general lack of anything happening in neutral. Remember, in theory, the trap is a counter-attacking strategy, but when your team isn't really good, true counterattacks that spring odd man rushes the other way, or any movement the other way cleanly, just don't really happen that much. And that's the kind of slow, bronchitis-like hockey that we started to see from more and more teams in the early 90s. Everyone did it kind of out of necessity to survive, regardless of whether or not it was beneficial. Like cocaine on Wall Street in the 80s. The Devils won with the trap, but they won with a really good team that used the trap really well from Brodeur out. When you have a team like the Devils use the trap, you get frustrated because you get nothing. When you have a team like the Panthers use the trap, you're asleep, because they don't get anything either. Obviously, I'm hyperbolizing, no game of hockey is that boring, but when you constantly see a slower pace, game in and game out, it starts to become predictable, and that's something that maybe watchers in this generation don't understand. It's easy to look at that footage from back then and just be mildly annoyed by the trap, but at the time it was so much worse because it was common enough that its specter hung over games before they were even played. You knew that a game with X trapping team against Y non-trapping or also trapping team that was going to run through the same old tired motions of attempted breakout, get stopped, ice the puck, face off, attempt the breakout, etc. And that prejudice has a habit of making the zeitgeist of the trap feel a lot worse. And if people feel bored watching hockey, hockey is committing sport's cardinal sin. The Devils showed how the trap could make champions out of a deep, well-rounded team. The Panthers showed how it could make competitors out of anybody. The trap had always been a way to negate a superior offensive talent, but the Devils had a few perennial 50, 60, even 70-point getters, and often the whole team contributed to a top 5 offense, so negating bona fide superstars and successfully counterpunching wasn't the tallest order, but the 94 and 95 Panthers only finished 1 point out of a playoff spot while having the 4th worst and the worst offense. And the 96 Panthers, while a significantly better team, made it all the way to the Cup Finals with only 4 players who got more than 50 points. If you're one of those 90s expansion teams made up mostly of cast-offs, suddenly the trap becomes a lot more appealing. I wouldn't say the Panthers popularized the trap because people only started talking about it and actually calling it the trap when the 95 Devils used it, but the 94 and or 95 Panthers definitely commodified it. In the 96 finals run, they were a better team for sure, but they weren't a completely different team, so they still carried that reputation of trap merchants with them. With their sudden success, around the league the trap became the full-time thing to do, regardless of whether or not it was best suited for your team. You may think that trend's short-sighted and ill-suited to long-term success or growth, and that's true. There's no second part to that. Keep in mind, the dead puck era only lasted about 10 years, but they were a loathed 10 years. Welcome to hell, if hell was nostalgic. But that's not to lay it all at the feet of the Panthers. If they didn't commodify it, somebody else would have. Because as mentioned, the trap was easy to learn. New teams with untested coaches could stand it up relatively easily, obviously wanting to be competitive as soon as possible. It was economical and it was effective, so most everyone did it. If not as a team system, then as a situational one. But it was boring. And this is where the criticism of the trap is its most valid. Everyone trapping means that teams trapped who didn't even need to, whose skill makeup wasn't allowed to fly free under the trap. Usually this meant offensively gifted teams. After all, why open up the ice and put more trust in the offense of your stars when you can lock down the ice and put more trust in your whole skater core? One team exemplified this perfectly. Ken Hitchcock in Dallas adopted it en route to winning the Cup in 1999, even though they had an offensively talented team and a Hall of Fame superstar in Mike Modano. You can see the team's immediate goal-scoring results turn on a dime as soon as he had his first full season behind the bench. Now, it's not like Modano's career was crippled by the change in systems. He's way too good of a player for that, and he actually adapted the system quite well, earning multiple Selke votes over the better part of the next decade. But are Selke votes what he needed? Is it what the fans wanted? His point totals noticeably capped and stayed painfully the same right around the time Hitchcock took over. They were still great, but he could have done a lot better in his mid-20s, I'm certain. And of course, the Stars were more than just Mike Modano. They were super talented around the turn of the millennium, but they were boring. Too boring for their level of skill, and doubly boring when playing against other teams who played boringly. But, because life is cruel, Hitchcock and the Stars got a Stanley Cup out of all of it in 1999, and not coincidentally, the Devils beat them in the finals the very next year. Another offensively gifted team that suffered in this era was the Kevin Constantine Penguins. Like the Stars, they were not bad by any means. They made the playoffs in all 3 years Constantine was the coach. But also like the Stars, they had Jaromir Jagr, Ron Francis, Stuart Douglas Barnes, Marty Straka, Alex Kovalev, and Robert Lang across those 3 years. There is no reason they should be playing defensive hockey in front of living human beings. And Kevin Constantine's coaching style, if you've seen my video on the 1994 Sharks, wasn't always fully defensive. Only the fivesome of Garpenlov, Makarov, Larionov, Norton, and Ozolinsh were allowed to play guts-out offensive hockey since they were really good at it. For whatever reason, from 1997 onwards, that didn't happen in Pittsburgh. Maybe it was because Mario Lemieux had just retired for the first time, and the future of the Penguins was again in doubt, so the team figured a conservative coaching style would help them stay afloat in a league where it was doing so for all kinds of non-contending teams. And it did. They were projected to sink, and they swam. But the tension between coach and players grew over time due to Constantine's exacting criticisms, and after 2.5 years, Constantine was out. There's one more team I want to focus on before the wrap-up. Remember how I said the Rangers' history for the next 20 years illuminates everything that there is to know about the trap and its effects on the league? Well, initially, that meant being one of the first 2 recorded teams to use it full-time. Then, it meant being the team that used it over multiple years, causing friction with its offensive players. And now, we've circled back around to the Rangers one last time. But this time, the story of the trap relates to these Rangers in the opposite way, because they consciously rejected it at a time when it was the status quo. The man who fought against the tide was Glenn Sather. He signed whoever he could to make the game exciting. And it was. The Rangers were still the victims of other teams using the trap, so they didn't get as many shots, but they scored a lot. Heck, the next season, Eric Lindros led the team in points after taking a year off. The 2001 Rangers had 250 goals for, 28th best out of all 227 team seasons in the Dead Puck era span, and 7th best that year. If there was any hope that a team with superstars could play intentional, offensive-minded hockey and discard the trap in this era of suffocation, it was the 2001 New York Rangers. And yet, the chance for this offensive success to maybe, long-shot hope, nudge a few superstar teams out of their trap orientation was wasted, because the Rangers fielded 6 goalies that year and none of them could stop a beach ball. It was funny because the Colin Campbell Rangers in the years immediately prior had fallen back on the 1-2-2. Specifically chosen words there, fallen back. Remember, the trap is economical to implement for players at almost any skill level. The team barely hit 500 in the regular season, and Messier, apparently the infallible source of leadership, decided in his infinite wisdom it was time to buy into the neutral zone trap. Whoop-de-doo. And it got them to the conference final in only 10 games. Freewheeling defenseman Brian Leetch went on record as suggesting that the reasons the Rangers lost to the Flyers and Penguins in 1995 and 1996 was because they got over-aggressive and didn't play defensively enough, which is what Roger Nielsen would never have allowed in his trap system, which is what Colin Campbell now was implementing with the Rangers again, which is what Glenn Sather's Rangers were now going right back to avoiding. Colin Campbell had one of the most damning, revealing quotes about the trap you will ever hear an NHL coach utter. "It's a bad word, I know, but we're going to the trap. Right now we can't score and we can't protect a lead. Everyone is winning with it. We want to frustrate teams the same way they frustrate us." And so, the late 90s Rangers jettisoned their free-skating, open-ice game. But once they retooled and brought on players who weren't ancient Wayne Gretzky and old Pat LaFontaine, old Asa Tikkanen, old Ulf Samuelsson, old Kevin Stevens, and old John McClain, they got stars who were slightly less old, and on the whole, at that point, better. That was the idea, at least. As I've shown, it kind of worked, but not substantially and not long-term. The Rangers never made the playoffs before the lockout. The light glittered in the darkness, and then was drowned by it. It's important to note that no team, not even the Devils, used the same trap season after season. Using the Devils as an example, from what I can tell, they experimented less with the 1-2-2 and more with the 1-1-3 as the decade soldiered on, eventually adapting their forecheck on a play-by-play basis. But to so many people, that nuance doesn't matter. Call the color whatever you want, it's still part of the same rainbow. In 2001, Mario Lemieux derided the trap, saying it's not what the league was trying to sell. The oh-so-quotable Mike Milbury said in 1995 that the neutral zone trap ruined the game and turned it into soccer. Everyone dunked on what the league was becoming. And even the rules that were intended to combat it, such as moving the net a foot up from the boards, was unsuccessful and despised. But things changed. I've covered the rule changes that took place over the 04-05 lockout plenty of times on this channel, but they actually did a decently good job of opening up the speed in the game. Over time, goalies kept getting better and better, so scoring started to drop again, but for a much more organic reason. Now, players are so fast and so good, even goalies are starting to look more human, with scoring the highest it's been in a couple decades. But here's what's funny. Ever since the lockout, you have never, ever seen a champion or finalist so derided for the use of the neutral zone trap like the teams of the late 90s were. Not even close. Not that teams don't use the trap, they do. I'd say the majority of them do. But why don't we notice it? Because all four of the other things in that list have also been taken care of. 1, the neutral zone trap's still around, as I just said. 2, the bigger and faster players, well, all players are now skilled enough to navigate through actual cell membranes, so that doesn't matter as much. Obstruction has been heavily cracked down upon. Perhaps too much, but it's definitely opened the game up way more. The two-line pass has been fired into the sun and atomized, thank goodness. And goalies negating the dump-ins has already been explained with the trapezoid rule. And honestly, it's probably for the best that of these 5, the trap is the one that remains in effect today. And since the game is so much faster than the 90s, skilled players are given runway to be skilled, and almost nobody complains about it. I remember the Capitals used the 1-1-3 trap in their 2018 championship run, and boring is the last word I would use to describe that postseason. So I think that's telling. People don't dislike the trap. They dislike being bored. And if the trap is, while a bit slower, not nearly as boring and stifling as it was 20-odd years ago, can we really say that the trap was the problem? Or was it just the most apparent symptom of a complacent league's rules failing to keep up with the skill level of its ever-increasing talent pool? I don't think the trap was the problem. I think the league's rules and rule enforcement was the problem, to allow any one defensive system to have the ability to take over the game so absolutely and so negatively. I want to leave you all with some food for thought. In a 2003 article for the Hockey News, the Dennis Potvin argued that shrinking the neutral zone actually worsened the effects of the trap, because it meant more people in transition, and people stopping them, had to take up a smaller space. He said goals scored are scored only after cycling the puck for an eternity, or after one-on-one blown coverages. That's to say, not on the rush. He said it was why older, mid-30s defensemen were winning Norrises, because there was no speed coming at them. His great fear was that the NHL would remove the center red line and the two-line pass, which would mean teams would line up on their own blue line in an even more boringly defensive posture. In the 2005 offseason, the NHL made exactly that rule change. But as we can see today, he wasn't right. Teams do stack up on the blue line and have active sticks on it to disrupt the puck carrier into sending one else off sides, but attacking players' puck handling skills are otherworldly now, and if you combine that with their heightened speed and the fact that they're no longer allowed to be pulled limb from limb as they head up ice, you can rely on the rush entering the zone just as often as you can the defense stopping them. All this is to say, even people who know the game inside and out can't know absolutely how the sport is going to evolve due to rule changes, or a lack of them. We can only look back at what was, and from the patterns outlined therein, only hope to have some vague idea of what future change to the rink, or to strategies, or to anything might dominate the league next, for better or worse. A massive, heartfelt thank you to every single one of my patrons, especially Amazing Kook 143, Eric Sheldon, Ethan Johnson, Infernos Gaming, It's Me Kowalski, Jacob Keefe, Jules, Nate, Pierre O'Connor, Pylon Zin, Steely Dan 32, and Stuckmund.